You might have seen some weird JSRF mods lately, like trying to collect the mystery tape in the garage, co-op test runs, or a sort of overhaul of Feature Site. If you look in the descriptions of each of these, they all talk about modifying mission files. I want to use this video for a high-level introduction to mission files, namely what they actually do, and then how JSRF uses them to create a playable game. You're not going to see any hex editors or anything like that yet. I'm just going to be talking from a design standpoint for now. So, let's get started. Open up the JSRF game files, and you'll see two things. The executable, which holds the game's code, and the media directory, which holds most of the game's assets. So, data, basically. As games go, JSRF has a pretty data-centric design. Its executable with all the code in it is fairly lean, 2 megabytes, compared to, say, Links 1 and 2 with 40 megabyte executables. A big reason for this is that JSRF's actual code really only implements the engine itself and the menus. Nearly anything else you can imagine, even some aspects of the game's logic, is stored as data. Mission files are the best example of this design. If we open up the media directory and then mission within it, we see a bunch of files, the mission files. They come in pairs, one bin and one dat. The DATs only seem to have some tag-related data, so we'll focus on the bins, which are usually what we mean when we say mission file. Each mission file has a 4-digit ID, which I'll explain later. Before we go any further, though, just what is a mission? The word never even appears in the game. Fortunately, the CXPX debugger can tell us when the game loads files, which can give us some hints. For instance, mission 0090 is loaded for the title screen. Starting a new game loads mission 0101. Completing the tutorial loads mission 0196. And starting jet dash and bottom point loads mission 3223. So, lots of things get missions. In fact, pretty much everything. I'll go further into that later too. So, we know where these missions are, so to speak, but not what they actually do. One way to see what effect these missions have is to swap them around and see what changes. So, what changes if we replace mission 0101 from the tutorial with the test run mission 3223? Basically everything. So, what do mission files do then? Basically everything? Well, more precisely, mission files dictate which resources to load and how to arrange them. Things like the stage, enemies, different characters, pedestrians, and when and how they appear. Missions also have the ability to make things happen, like spawning the aforementioned enemies and characters, as well as simple logic to control them, like when those enemies appear and what happens after you defeat them, or what happens after you clear all the tags in a stage. On the other hand, missions do not contain the actual models, textures, animations, or cutscene data that these things use. The missions just say to load that data and do a particular thing with it. Now, I said I'd get back to the question of which things get their own missions. The answer is that nearly everything does, except for the opening credits, load game menu, versus menu, and graffiti menus. But it's not just that you're almost always in a mission, but also that missions are very fine-grained. Let's look at an example. In Chapter 1, Dogenzaka Hill uses 4 different missions. Mission 0110 is the one you spend most of your time in. When you talk to Beat, though, and you see a cutscene of him skating away, that's in mission 0111. Each time you catch up to him and he runs off again, the game switches to mission 0111 to show him skating away before switching back to 0110 where you have control again. When you decide to race him, the game loads up mission 0112, after which you're dumped back into mission 0110 for a cutscene, and you're dragged into mission 0113 for the cop fight. Once that's dealt with, you return to 0110 in peace. That's quite a lot of stuff, but there are a few takeaways here. The first is that story mode is an intricate web of different missions that you're constantly jumping between. The second is that many missions aren't a one-and-done kind of thing. You can come back to them multiple times, and something different will happen each time. This is because missions can read and write game state, allowing one mission to check what you've done in another. For instance, mission 0112 sets a flag once you win the race, and every time you enter mission 0110, it checks if that flag is set. And if it is, it plays a cutscene where the cops show up, loads up mission 0113, and unsets that flag, so that when you come back to mission 0110 later, that cutscene doesn't play anymore. It's also worth mentioning that nothing else is shared between these missions. If all 4 of these missions want cans to appear in the same places, for instance, all 4 need to specify their locations separately. Likewise for pedestrians, cars, exits, and so on. This means a lot of duplication between missions, but it also makes them very modular, hence us being able to swap out missions and still have the game function perfectly fine. Finally, you may have noticed that all of these missions' IDs start with 011. This has to do with the naming scheme for missions. For story mode, the first digit is always 0. The second digit is then the chapter number, in this case 1 for the first chapter, and the third digit roughly corresponds to which stage the mission is in. Although, they do sometimes run out of digits for a given chapter and have to get creative. The last digit then usually starts at 0 or 5 and gets incremented for each successive mission in a given stage. Now, there are other numbering schemes as well as some special values, but most missions will follow this convention. The rest of the game works much the same as these 4 missions. In fact, from the game's perspective, there's nothing special about these 4 missions as a group. I selected them because they're all on the same stage, but nothing stops me from putting the cop fight in the garage, for example. As far as the game's concerned, there's no real difference between getting sent to mission 0113 by the cutscene with the cops showing up, and getting sent to mission 0120 by skidding over to Shibuya Terminal. Both just load up a mission like any other. Nothing even says that going back the way you came has to load the same mission you just came from either. The one grouping of missions that does matter is chapters. Missions only directly link to other missions in the same chapter, and there is a special routine to advance to the next one. This means that Dogenzaka Hill in chapters 1 and 2 are completely separate. They're totally different mission files. You can modify chapter 1 Dogenzaka however you want, and it would have no impact whatsoever on Dogenzaka in chapter 2. This has some funny implications. You know how you're not allowed to go to 99th Street in Chapter 1? You might have wondered what would happen if you somehow unlocked it. But the thing is, there is no mission for 99th Street in Chapter 1. Consequently, the garage mission for Chapter 1 doesn't connect that exit to anything. 99th Street simply does not exist in this part of the game. The idea that you go back to the same garage throughout the game, in every chapter, and that its different exits are unlocked as you progress, is mostly an illusion. Every chapter has its own garage mission, linked to its own completely independent Tokyo, which is made up of fewer missions spanning fewer stages earlier in the story, and more missions spanning more stages later in the story. Very different from the impression the game tries to give you of just a couple continuously evolving stages. Alright, that was a whole lot. I've still skipped over a bunch of stuff, and we haven't even looked at the actual contents of a mission file, but that's a basic overview of what they are and how they're used. Their scope is simply enormous, so it would take an obscene amount of time to explain it all. Nevertheless, we are trying to do precisely that, and there's still a ton we don't fully understand. Everything we do know comes from the work of a couple people digging into the game, like Daft7 on the JSRF Reverse Engineering Discord, and myself, completely separately, because Discord doesn't show up in a web search when you're looking for prior art. That's why I decided to make an accessible introduction to the topic here. If you want to know more, or even contribute, you can see all of my work to date in the GG Notebook repository, as well as a bunch of spreadsheets on the Discord server, not to mention people to talk to there. Lastly, I would indeed like to share more progress and explanations on this channel too, so if you want to see more of this in video format, stay tuned.